Welcome to our dual broadcast today, Real Mormonism and Doctrine of Christ YouTube channel for our Sunday study. We continue our Real Mormonism Nephites in Europe series. We'll probably conclude today the Nephites in Europe part 3. We're going to look at a handful of additional pieces of evidences that are intriguing, enlightening, and actually a bit informative as well. Regardless of whether or not the listener believes that it helps add to the argument that this group of Nephites did indeed go to Europe. We think it does, and we'll show how we think it ties in. The last 2 weeks, 2 episodes, we looked at different things like the names of tribes of the peoples of the Anglos and the Saxons, etc., in that northern part of Europe, northern Germany, Denmark, etc., their history, of what we know about the Anglo-Saxons, and how a lot of that stuff ties in some of their cultural markers and aspects. Today, we're going to look at some more linguistics with some naming conventions, not of the tribes, but of specific peoples, and some other aspects, which here's a fun one. We mentioned this, the lore behind Lord of the Rings that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote. We're going to look a little more in depth at some of those pieces that are fun, that very possibly connect to this as well. So with that said, one of the things that we want to look at with this naming convention, Josh has pointed out a lot to do with the Elbe River, which is in that northern Germany, Denmark, right there in that corner. In fact, we got to pull that up again. Josh, you want to pull that up on a map if you can?
Yeah, we'll do.
Just for another good reference. So that Elbe River ends up being a really big marker where this Elben people, which Elven, the V and B become interchangeable linguistically over time. So the Elven people, or the Elben people, are these people near the Elbe River, these Anglo-Saxon peoples, right? So we're going to look at how that word Elb or Alb or El or Al starts to permeate not only Anglo-Saxons, but lots of the other names in naming conventions of peoples throughout Europe, which is really, really fascinating. Probably one of the largest of which is how the land of England, that area long ago, was referred to as Albion. Now, ALB and ELB, considering linguistically interchangeable, Elb and Alb, really similar. So that's an interesting thing to consider, that England was called Albion. Okay, so here's Europe. We zoom in on this, and then we're going to see right up there in that northern Germany, Denmark area.
There we go.
Get right over there to the right.
Okay.
There she be, right there.
Yeah, this yellow area is known as Magna Germania, which is Latin, but Greater Germany. Depending on the era you're looking at, you're going to get different versions of this. A lot of them will show, England being entirely Latin, which can be the case given a particular century, but it's not really true. These are German and Celtic peoples, not Latin, Roman. Anyway, go ahead.
The Elbe right there. You know, circle that a little bit with your mouse. We see that, and it's right there by the Saxons. You see,
it's coming in
right about right at that corner area.
Albus, right there. So obviously it almost runs southward. It's obviously okay. The headwaters are here in Central Europe and flowing to the northwest, but the movement of Roman expansion comes underneath that, and here On the northeast side is where Berlin is located, which is kind of the heartland of German power and people, and also the heartland of, well, you can see the Saxons right there,
And the angles
um,
above them.
and the Angles above them. And this is also the heartland of the Langobards, which are, you see the place name coming in a little bit lower here,
Yeah, right there.
as well as literally the Elven people themselves, which again, Elven is the same as Elben or Alban. All of the pronunciations are dependent on era and dialect and so forth, but they all are pointing to that same original word.
Right, and linguistically speaking, the al, the alb or albus is of more of the Latin origin, which we see right here on this map, versus the elb, which is more of the Germanic way of doing it. So that's an interesting thing looking at the linguistics, and we see that albus meaning white, right? And that's where we get this meaning, right? Was this elb or alb referring to? And it has to do with the word white. And it's like, okay, so we obviously know that the peoples that lived there were white people, n- not too different from you and me. But is that really the whole purpose of it? Because a lot of Europe was white skinned. So when we take that marker and say, okay, just equals just means just because they're white people, it's like, well, there has to be something more because this whole continent's full of white people. I mean, and not just white people, obviously, but it's full of white people. We just know that, and so to just
Yeah.
say, well, that's there has to be more to it. So, Josh, talk to us a little bit about that significance and about that meaning behind the L there, the elb.
Well, it's really curious. First of all, what we want to do, we don't want to take our modern linguistic tradition and or mess around the term white and superimpose
Right.
it on the past. What we want to do is try to understand um, what what was going on here with this word and what was it trying to describe, what was its origin, and then does it actually connect into the modern concept of whiteness, which I would say it does and it doesn't, depending on how you look at it. There definitely is a link, um, but it has become a very politicized term and not a well-defined one in modern times and very controversial, which is curious though. Like, why? Who cares? And so this is really interesting to start to realize there may have been a legacy to this term, centered on a culture and a group of people that are significant, to the Book of Mormon, significant to our modern identity, that were going under basically the same name. But you know, what does the name actually point to? And so, um, let me pull. Sorry, I was on the wrong screen. So at any rate, no, now I need to go to.
So while you're pulling that up, if we're hypothesizing that there was House of Israel influence here, right?
Mhm.
Then we might say, okay, well, what would the root of elb be for Hebrew, right?
Right.
And we're of course we're hypothesizing because we say, well, there is no Hebrew connection to it. Okay, maybe there's not, but if there is, if we're hypothesizing that there's this Hebraic people, these Israelite people,
Yeah.
and they have this word elb there,
Hmm.
then we clearly have a root that should be obvious to anyone that is familiar with any of these Hebrew roots, right?
Right. And so the word in question in Hebrew is El. And whether we're coming out of Greek or Latin or Nephite, we're actually looking at House of Israel, 10 tribes kind of people, um, or or Jewish people, depending how you look at the Nephites. But so we're gonna get to Hebrew anywhere we go with these groups. And so was this a Latin name imposed on the people up in Germany, or was it actually coming from them, or did they both have a similar word that kind of merged? And alb coming out of the Latin, elb coming out of the German. We can only hypothesize. But what's curious is the centrality of the name here, the river, which is at the center of a civilization or a culture, and that they are known by that name. And it's supposed that, I mean, if you see that the river's called that, then you think, oh, they're kind of named after the river. Um, but that begs the question, well, what's the river named after? And are they named after the river, or did the river get named after the people? So, but let's go back to our main theory that Hagoth and his people came and settled in Northern Europe. And they took on various names moving forward, which related to things that were special to them, or fathers or leaders of the movement, and or important words, concepts, and ideas. So we talked about the Eusipi being tied to Joseph, the Frisians being tied to the free land, the free people, and so forth. So when we get to the Elven people, which this name in particular early on took an important place, and is the name singled out by Tolkien in his efforts to try to preserve German mythology. And if they are Hebrews, the most likely tie-in to this word is Hebrew El, and so we know that El or Elb or Alb has a strong connection to white. And if we look at that here, let me pull up. Oh, that's the wrong one.
While you're pulling that up, to address the issue of, okay, do they just take the name because they're just naming after the river, or is the river more named after the people? I think you could say, well, it's named after the people more than that other way around, because we have that ALEL permeating other aspects. Like I mentioned, they eventually call the England area Albion. Now, there's different arguments for as to why. Like, oh, maybe it's because of the White Cliffs of Dover that gave it that way. So if you're only coming from that area, then it's like, oh, it's the White Land.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, yeah, but it's also where the Anglo-Saxons went. And we see how they spread throughout Europe, and then we see that AL and EL, Alb and Elb and Elf and Alf and Elv and Alv. You can switch the V, the F, the B, and you start seeing that in a lot of names. And all of a sudden you're like, well, it seems more like a people description than just this river.
So, is it up on the screen now?
Yeah. You can zoom in on that, make it big.
Okay. I just had to switch windows around there. Zooming in.
Yeah, so for anybody that is
Looks like Dustin muted out there for a second. So, looking at the word.
Yeah, my mic went out. Sorry, my mic went out. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just introducing for anyone that doesn't have familiarity with the Hebrew word. That's what Josh has got this pulled up. It's really quick and easy to find out. It's one of the most known.
It's fun. It's cool because it's not like, this wasn't like deep research. This was like, wait a minute, what we know that El in Hebrew refers to God, but in what sense? In Saxon, the word God is basically the same as the word good. And so when we use the word God, we're calling our Father in heaven good.
Right, we're invoking the idea of the source of goodness, right?
Yeah. So it literally means a good thing, or that He is the source of goodness. It's an aspect of his godhood, is that He is good. So the two words are, well, did good come from God, or did God come from good? Either way, we're trying to understand, in the case of El, what does it mean? So just a quick search, the Hebrew etymology of El tells us God. It means God, and it originates from the Proto-Semitic root signifying might, strength, or power. And so, um, this was actually a theory of mine that that is what El meant. But I never looked it up. I just thought it's probably means something like that, because how I got there was looking at when you think about a group of Hebrews coming in, calling themselves what might have meant something like the white people. What were they trying to describe their skin color? And I would say that's not what they were trying to do. Um, if if you're trying to differentiate yourself from another group, you might do something like that. But I don't think that's what they were trying to do. I think they were calling on something more core to their identity, which is to say, and this is typical of the house of Israel, we are a covenant people. We are a people under God. We're a godly people. We are a people that belong to God. And so covenant people, covenant land, is one way that Hebrews have referred to themselves. And so if they were to say, hey, we are the people of God, and they use the word El, meaning the people of the strength of or might or power of God. Um, Power. So we know that light. So like the spirit of the Lord, the light of the Lord, the knowledge, the power, these concepts all flow together. His light is his spirit, and his light is his power. And so again, getting back to the origin of these words, we have this concept of El, or the power of God, and people naming themselves after this aspect of God, which then comes to be associated with whiteness or brightness, if you will. And so if we jump over, well, what does white mean? And if we dive into the etymology here, we learn it literally means light or to shine, and or to brighten. And so the relationship between the concept, like the etymological concept of white or whiteness, and the etymological concept of God, and his might, strength, and
or
power,
El.
in terms of the word El. So El, or Elb, meaning white, and white meaning light or brilliant or shining. The argument is strong that Elb is none other than Hebrew El. So the people of God,
The
or
Elben people are the people of God.
yeah, the people of God. Um, so that's our connection there on that.
So here's what's interesting to me. So it goes back to a really old argument about the use of the word white in the Book of Mormon describing these people, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Saying, well, it must be just describing their righteousness because we can't be talking about their skin color. And skin color becomes such a divisive topic, unnecessarily so, because God made all skin colors, and he esteems all flesh the same, none above the other. So it doesn't matter, right? And it's like, oh, easy for you to say because you're white. Well, whatever, but that's what the scriptures say. So whatever, paint me whatever color, but that's what the scriptures say. So it doesn't matter. And there's enough evidence. We're talking about Nephites living to Europe, and you're like, oh, so they'd be white. But we've also mentioned briefly, and haven't had time to dive into evidences of other Nephite groups that went elsewhere into across the Pacific, eventually, right? Some
Mm-hmm.
Japanese tie-ins and some Polynesian island tie-ins, etc. Um, there's some interesting tie-ins where you might be able to make some arguments there. Well, not might be able to. You can make some arguments. So regardless of all that, uh, we have this piece that the Book of Mormon has already been argued to show that the white means the brilliance of the light of the Spirit, right? And how the scriptures talk about being white through the blood of the Lamb. Isaiah 118, come let us reason together, saith the Lord, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be, uh, you know, white like wool, though they be red like crimson, they shall be as or white as snow, though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. It's the idea of being white through Jesus Christ, right? So
Mhm.
so that's what's so interesting. We have this people of God, this white people, and especially when we take a turn here after this segment of the names that we'll talk about, we'll also turn to talk about the Lord of the Rings lore, where that is paramount with the elven people being a people of light,
Mhm.
like Galadriel being
Yeah.
the main elf queen that represents light in that sense. Which anyway, we'll talk more about it, but it's worth mentioning right now since it's part of this episode. And here we're talking about this idea of what does this white actually mean. So you can't emphasize it enough. Now, at the same time, the Anglo-Saxons were also white of skin, right? That particular people, but
Mhm.
but the elb has to mean more than that.
Yeah, it's well, and we could say the term enlightened in modern speak, you could have dark skin and be enlightened. There would be no weirdness in using that phrasing to describe someone with darker skin tones. They can be dark in coloring, but enlightened in mind, in spirit, in body, and so forth. And so, um, but we seem to have taken on. Well, I would like to suggest. I think it makes sense to me that the concept of whiteness has we have inherited it from an earlier age, but that in modern times it's been politicized and used um, incorrectly, but to try to create racial tension between two groups of people, which ironically both groups of people have similar claim to House of Israel in the Americas and to enlightenment in that sense. But the concept again, if you hail from or have any English or German blood, you hail from Albion, depending on again era we're talking about. But that was a name that would be in the lineage or the background um, of our history, and it's referring to this idea of being connected to God, being a covenant people, being an enlightened or bright or powerful people through God.
Right.
And if in modern times, if that's true, if the quote unquote white people, um, if that's the origin of the term, and they're descending out of that lineage, and Satan or his kingdom would have a vested interest in trying to um, vilify that group of people or that lineage and try to make it a bad thing to come from that. Because we do, again, in modern times, whiteness used in the negative sense doesn't ultimately refer to skin color, because if whatever race or skin color you are, if you embrace the culture or um, the wrong political side, so to speak, you'll be labeled white because of your beliefs, your attitudes, your actions, playing into a quote unquote white agenda. And so it really is there's a cultural influence, or there are influences within our culture. One coming out of this Germanic English whiteness, and then kind of a modern pushback on that, and saying this group, they're the patriarchy, they're the oppressors, the European oppressors. And it's not to say that Europeans never made any mistakes, um, um, but to try to get people in this lineage to a not know who they are, not being able to connect up their ancient lineage and have a sense of where they come from and who they are, but b to view their very, I was just born into this body and into this culture, and I'm guilty simply because I'm a member. Um, well, it's pretty suspicious to me that that's become the status quo with it, when it has this rich legacy of referring to an enlightened group of people or a covenant group of people under God. And so God's people always being singled out and persecuted by Satan's kingdom, it again makes a compelling argument.
Yeah, it does. And thanks for sharing that. So what I was pulling up here while you were talking is when you look up on Wikipedia, what's interesting is it talks about Albion being, this another word for the area of Great Britain, right? And one of the top things here, which is interesting, it's like, well, maybe the White Cliffs of Dover may have given rise to this term Albion, which means, land of,
Right.
these white peoples. It's like, well, but it's Albion means more like the white peoples more than the white dirt. But regardless, it is interesting. I have to pull that here because it's like, well, maybe that did, except it's like if you say, okay, well, if that's why they called it Albion, then why did that name permeate all these other places? It becomes inconsistent. So
Yeah.
that's why I
It
bring it up.
comes it comes out of north central Germany way before it comes out of this area.
Exactly.
So
Right.
that
Which yeah.
easily predate it's referring to a group of people who didn't live there until much later. So this is your 30-second research job right here where it's like, what does Albion mean? Oh, it refers to the White Cliffs of Dover. That's really um revisionist history that well, and not even that's glorifying it too much. It's just like we don't really know. There's these white cliffs, so maybe that's the origin of things. It's the same thing as saying, well, the Elbe River, what the people were called after that river, and that river just happened to be called the White River, and we don't know why. And so again, it's you have to think about the larger picture and the connections. And anyway, within our theory of Nephites in Europe and a Hebrew people coming in, well, and this is a great segue into naming conventions. What were the naming conventions of the people in Hebrew? To use L in a name is probably more common than any other naming convention. Words like Michael, Gabriel, Ariel,
Israel.
Israel, they all end in L.
Right.
And those names all refer to um, something and God or
Bethel.
something. Yeah,
City
so
names, city names as well as people names.
mhm. Yeah, exactly. So it might mean the strength of God or the courage of God or the heart of God or and that was a naming convention. And that naming convention has a name, um,
Dithematic naming.
diathematic naming. Yeah.
Yeah, we're
And this
taking
is
two
fun.
themes and putting them together.
Let's see. I have to pull this window over to the other one.
So while you're doing that, what's just interesting here about this Albion, you see that it permeates, you know, it permeates the whole area where it's even not only the name for the area of Great Britain, but also just for even for Scotland, calling it Alba in Gaelic or Albane, or Nalbine or Alban or Albany in the
Mhm.
anglicized version. Anyway, it's just interesting how much it permeates, and like you said, it way predates it. So this is just a little bit comical to say, oh, maybe because of the White Cliffs of Dover. You're like, well, no, that's just you're clearly not paying attention to all these other markers where we can see that it's tying into something else, and we are making the case that it's meant to tie into these Hebrew roots, pointing to this relationship to El or to God.
Yeah. And so, well, we can pull up, let's just do that. Meaning of Michael. And it's going to say,
Who
okay,
is like
who
God
is
or
like
gift from
God
God?
or the gift from God, right? And if we do Gabriel, um, a hero of God. So you see that L coming through is always referring to God. Um, now we have a river and a group of people carrying super um, phonetically close word to describe themselves. And we get into this concept of diathematic naming, where you have um, diathematic means two themes, or there are two parts to the name.
Yeah,
And
zoom in on that if you can. It's a little small.
yeah, good idea. And interestingly enough, it is well, these Hebrew names that we just looked at are diathematic names. It's a Hebrew thing to do that. Now you come over here, it's also a Germanic thing to do that. Germanic names are traditionally diathematic. That is, they are formed of two elements by joining a prefix and a suffix. So the idea is you have column A, which is prefixes, and column B, which is suffixes. You can pick any one from either column, combine them together to create a unique name or semi-unique name. And this is, so if we come down to, there's just a list here of a bunch of names. Um, Now it's all zoomed in, but, well, these are, hold on a minute. Element, meaning, oh yeah, so you get prefixes and suffixes
All right, choose
further
from
down
one column, choose from another column, put them
and put
together.
it together. So these are, so the prefix arb, herb, or earth, and here are the names. But that word refers to inheritance. Um, and if you come down here to, let's get down to elf. One of the
Wait,
biggest
pass it. You're an
ones.
F now. Go back.
Did I pass it?
Go up a little bit. You're an E. Oh, does this one not show it? Because I've got some here.
Oh, I thought it did. Oh, there it is.
Oh,
It was under A for
oh,
L.
right, because first it's alb or alf and or
Alf
even elf.
or yeah, Alf or Aelf, Elf, Alf. Um, and in this case doesn't offer a definition, or does it? Oh, well, no, it means elf. And so these names, Alfric, Alfred, Alfwin, there's quite a list if we had time to pull it up, but that all referring to names that have elf as a component of the name. And so, again, the idea here is that the naming convention of Hebrew peoples, as well as Germanic peoples, is to take from column A and to take from column B a prefix and a suffix, put them together to make a unique name. And so it might be, elf friend, elf counselor. Elfric means elf ruler, for example, or elf king. Um, and so the idea is, and then when we're talking about the Germanic, we're further along in the future than with original Hebrew names. Um, I would say, biblically speaking. So we're looking at a later period. But interestingly enough, there is another group of people who are well known for using diathematic naming, and that is the Native Americans. And everybody knows if you live here, the idea of like, flying eagle or now I sound kind of stupid trying to come up with ideas randomly, but to take two parts, I don't know, running bear, right? That might sound like
Running bear, sitting bull, famous name.
yeah, exactly. So here we have Native Americans doing the exact same thing as the Germanic peoples, but it's interesting because Native American diathematic naming definitely takes on a flavor of they refer to natural things around them more than they do refer to like spiritual or God related concepts. So they tend to, let's look at this river, or let's look at that this, well, animals are like probably the most central theme to. And
Right.
when you think about the Lamanites who survive the destruction of the last battle for the Nephite civilization, they put to death anybody who would not deny the Christ, right? And so anybody who was kind of religiously inclined in that sense, or wanted to take on the identity of God or Christ, in the Nephite sense, well, they were killed. So in that society, it became very taboo to continue to take on that identity. But the naming convention, the way you name people moves forward, right? You just can't talk about God anymore. You can't talk about Christ anymore. So the names take on a little more idolatry moving forward. Like, well, eagles are noble. Let's refer to those. Let's refer to the bears and the animals, and that would be kosher. Whereas you had to cut out the spiritual stuff. Well, the Nephite line through Hagoth going somewhere would take with them the naming convention, and they would preserve these more spiritual or God-centric elements as strong component of, hey, we're a people of God and we name our kids according to that idea. Um, and so you see kind of an origin in Hebrew or Hebrewism, and then moving into the Lehite civilization, and then you have a split with Hagoth going over to Europe. And, obviously the Germanic names have their own evolution and move into a more distinct Germanic style of this naming convention. And then the Native Americans have their own distinct version of it moving forward that's particular to their history. And in this case, they're dwindling in unbelief and needing to cut out
Right.
the theme of God and Christ from their tradition and society.
Yeah, let me pull up just since we're talking about it, let me pull up some examples then. So here's
Yep.
some of this is a fun website behind the name because you can say, oh well, give me different genders or give different usages, etc., etc. So in this case, I said English. We can say Anglo-Saxon, which we will in a second. Alfred, right? So counsel, elf, counsel, as you mentioned, or
Yep.
advice. Now, elf counsel is like, well, what's the significance of elf counsel? It's like, well, we just said elf is actually God. So this is counsel of God.
Yeah.
So Alfred,
In the
counsel of
later
God, right?
culture, which had lost, the later we get, the more we've lost our roots, right? But the idea of elf in English or Saxon is it's like something really good. And so you wanted to name your kids after this because it was something that was really good. If we go back further,
Right.
we think we know what that means. We think it actually refers to God himself, just like the Hebrews used to do with Michael and Gabriel and so forth. Um, and so but
Right.
what's cool
And some more
here,
examples here. So we have like elf beauty.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, no, like, yeah, elf gift, elf beauty, elf queen, everything elf. Because you're referring to lightness, enlightenment, brilliance, God are all bundled up in that concept. And so, again, just like the older Hebrew names, you're going for that, even if at this period of time there's something of a disconnect in the people who are using the convention. They don't necessarily appreciate it any longer. But what is really important to note here is that even though, what's the evidence that Tolkien was right about this, or that Tolkien was actually referring to a real and literal people,
Right.
and that we today here in the United States with European origin have anything to do with it? Well, our own names tell us the story. We still name our kids these names. They are the
Well,
traditional names.
let's throw out some more. Let's throw out some more. So Alvin is
Yep,
a good one.
Alvin. Yeah, put it into
What,
the thing.
so what does Alvin mean? Right.
Yep.
Let's see. Does it you just say Alvin? Search that directly. Old Norse cognitive Alfwin. Does it have the meaning on here? It's not giving the
Just
actual
click on one of
definition.
those.
Like this one.
Yeah, click on it.
Yeah,
So
elf
it
friend.
goes. It means elf friend. Now, I would make the case on this one that Alvin and Elven are exactly the same word. And the
Right,
idea again is
exactly.
that an elf is a good thing. So an elf is your friend because an elf is a righteous, enlightened person. So the modern definition is varied a little bit to say, well, elven means like a friend who's an elf, a friendly elf sort of a thing. Well, elves are friendly because they're righteous. So I think when you look at the phonetics and try to trace it that way, elven and alvin are too dang close to say, well, alvin is a separate word from elven. And I mean, I guess
Well,
it's
it just
possible, but if
it would just, at the end of the day, it would just mean friend of God. So
yeah, or
you're
God's
God's
friend.
people. Being elven means you're a friend of God. Oh, we're one of God's people.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, today we have you can name your kid Roman. It's a semi-popular name these days. And what does Roman refer to? Well, it refers to Roman people. This idea of, I mean, if that's your thing, um,
Right.
the power and might of Rome, and mighty Roman warrior, whatever. So Alvin, I think, is very. I think it's basically the same thing on the other side. You're just
Yeah, and then we have
calling your kid after that people.
right, exactly. But then that people is being called after God, so it's the friend of
Exactly.
God or people of God.
Exactly. Yep.
So an Elben people or Elven people, Alvin people, Alvin. So now we have the word Oliver, which more common, 100 years ago than it is today, but it's actually made a comeback in the last 10 years from what I was studying on the internet. Um, so Oliver is often traced to the French Olivier, olive, etc. And interestingly, that actually has its own connections. But you can also make a really strong case in the Germanic history, in the Anglo-Saxon history of Alfihar, Oliver, for the elf army, which would be army of God or army of the elf people, right? So there's two possibilities, but linguists argue that, and so that's another interesting name. There's quite a few names there. Let's see. Oh, I can go back to. Let me just see if there's a couple more here. If I go back to the list of saying, okay, show me all the ones. Scroll down this one just a little bit. Boldness, daring elf, boldness, elf, the boldness of God, victory, elf siege, Elfston, stone, etc., etc. So, and these are obviously older ones that will have their own versions in other languages. But what happens is you see a lot of these types of names getting into other languages in Europe. That's a point that essentially we could start making where we say, well, it's not just in Anglo-Saxon and English names. It starts getting into a lot of the other in Italian names and or Latin-based names rather. Um,
Yep. Of course,
and we see that.
Germanic tribes swept all of Europe through the centuries, so there is mixing going on at different points. And
Yeah, right, exactly. That's the whole point. Is we see that we see we see the Langobards going south. We see a lot of these other Germanic tribes sweeping throughout Europe, and so that starts to explain why this Alb and Elb and Alf and Elf, those types of pieces in the names are getting into all these other countries, all these other languages throughout Europe, uh, because it's connecting to that spread. And so this Albus in Latin or Elben in Germanic starts taking form in all these languages. And so just anybody that want to go on there and just dabble and see all the different names you might get, you're going to get a lot of options like Alfonso. Alfonso is a very popular name in for Italian, for Spanish, etc., Portuguese, and that's coming from the Alf. Same thing. It's no different. So anyway, so that piece is really curious. And you already mentioned this, but I just want to point out the actual scripture because the Book of Mormon tells us that the Lamanites became an idolatrous people. So what it was removing God for sure, we know that, but then also replacing it with idols. Well, you can't be more typologically idolatrous than just worshiping animals like they did anciently. And so the way that the Native Americans put nature as their god is a form of idolatry. And I'm not meaning to speak bad about Native American people. They could worship however they choose, but from the standpoint of the Book of Mormon, looking at the Lamanite people and how they went that direction,
Mm-hmm.
and we make that connection to the Native Americans, we say, oh, okay, that makes sense. The idolatry, and so their names took on that idolatry, where they had that diathematic naming convention, but because they're removed from God and replacing with idols, well, all of our names are based on nature, based on animals that we revere. We revere the bear, we worship the eagle, the sun, the wind, the waters, the wolf, the deer, etc., etc. So that idolatry starts to permeate while people that were the Nephites chasing after God, that was their focus, those infuse into their names. Now, does that mean everyone that had those names were righteous? Obviously not. It's just the culture of the people that permeates and gets handed down. And after a while, people might even stop thinking about the name. I mean, currently, no one thinks about this meaning of Elf and Alf pointing to being related to God at all. That's why we want to talk about it, because it has that ancient significance that that's worth mentioning, right?
Yeah. And so I just pulled up a scripture here. This is 1 Nephi 13. This is talking about the demise of the Nephites, but then shifting over to the Gentiles.
Right, Nephi's
Um,
vision.
right. And so in verse 14 and 15, it came to pass that I beheld many multitudes of the Gentiles upon the land of promise, and I beheld the wrath of God that it was upon the seed of my brethren, and they were scattered before the Gentiles were smitten. And I beheld the Spirit of the Lord. Now, look at the language. I mean, look at the elements that are in this scripture. The Spirit, I beheld that the Spirit of the Lord was upon the Gentiles, and they did prosper and obtain the land for their inheritance. And I beheld that they were white and exceedingly fair and beautiful, like unto my people before they were slain. Now, again, if you want to just take this to a skin color place, I think you're overlooking a lot richer um, sort of offering here in the word of the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord is associated with the Gentiles, and right here, Nephi decides to use the word white to describe these Gentiles and also say, this was how my people were and looked before they were destroyed by the people who chose to dwindle in unbelief from there on out. So, this idea of whiteness, it is early on in Nephi's mind, or at least this is how it is translated to us through the gift and power of God, through Joseph. Um, here this is an element or a theme or what would you call it? Like, this is a mechanism of language and speech being employed
Right.
to try to describe the Nephites before they were slain, and this is a quality that the Gentiles also have, and it is connected to the Spirit of the Lord. And the Lord's Spirit is light and bright and brilliant and powerful. And then you have these, early Haggothite Germans naming their heartland after a similar concept, the Alban or Elban whiteness, brightness, brilliance, God concept. And then that era of the elven people or the enlightened people lives on to this day in our naming convention. And Nephi prophesied the whole thing, saying, when these Gentiles showed up, they seemed to have a similar character culture, attitude, whatever. Let's, you know, we could invoke a lot of concepts here to try to describe this it factor that the Gentiles had that was similar to what the Nephites had. So the
Yeah.
idea of the whiteness, the brightness, the brilliance, the spirit being with these people um, is so cool to me. And then I love further this idea that so-called white people in modern times, Satan's kingdom has tried to demonize the idea of whiteness and vilify it and make this particular group of people ashamed of their heritage and what what they bring to the table, um, that is not important. And if there's
S-
if that legacy is there, it would be a key accomplishment for Satan to do that.
For sure. And this would be, so we've established now the importance of this naming convention behind Elben,
Yeah.
and we've mentioned in all three parts so far J.R.R. Tolkien trying to preserve the lore of the Anglo-Saxon people. So it's their own lore, which is part of their history, part of their culture, part of their identity. So let's take a look at the lore behind Lord of the Rings. Some of the key elements, some of the overarching elements. There's some stuff here. So we have the elven people, the elves in the lore.
Hmm.
Notice they are from the west.
Yep.
And notice that they are there to help Middle Earth before returning to the west. Those are
Yeah.
two overarching themes that are just like that could that
Well, and
could have
like, how do you get from the west to the east? You have to cross the ocean.
you have to cross the ocean. And
You have to
that's
understand.
exactly what the elves do. They come to Middle Earth by boat,
Yeah,
and then when it's time they return to the west in boat.
and the west, like the Elven West, is even within the book itself, it's very mystic because you have these elves living um, in Middle Earth for centuries, if not longer. They don't just like go back and forth to
Right.
the homeland. It's
Right.
a separate place, and they are now here in Middle Earth. And I mean, yeah, there's some exception to that where the king can permit somebody to go back or whatever. But
Well, you have to be
um,
invited. You have to be invited to go to Valinor, by the way.
yeah,
You
yeah,
can't just
totally.
you can't just go.
So the origin of the Elven people in Middle Earth is this other land to the west, which it's more than just a continent. It's some kind of enlightened, advanced place that they came from, and that at some point they will return to. So
Right.
thematically, very cool in terms of Book of Mormon, Nephite, European concept that a branch was broken off from an era of the Nephite civilization that was very enlightened and very righteous. And they came over and were infused into what I would say is the Celtic tree of Europe, which Celtic meaning the Israelite lineages that were already there, but I would suggest needed an infusion. And so, and we understand from Jacob 5 this idea that the Lord keeps moving branches around because, oh, I got a good branch over here, but the tree over there is dying. I got to move a branch over to save the tree and stuff like that. So I would suggest that's what's going on in the idea of Hagoth going to Europe, a branch being stuck into a Celtic tree, which had a good origin, good roots, but was struggling to move forward. So the infusion of the Hagoth Nephite blood,
Right.
in terms of culture, religion, scripture, spirit, all of that, might have been what really saved the day. Because this, Hagoth comes in 50 BC, right at the moment that Rome is going haywire, that Caesar is taking over the Republic and turning it into an empire.
Yeah, they're on the
Um,
rise. They're taking over land after land at this point. and will
Yeah.
continue for the next 150 years until their peak.
Yep. And so right at that moment, there's an insert of 5,000 Nephite men under Hagoth, which in all likelihood was some kind of war battalion, or uh, Hagoth was probably a military leader in the war, and the men that followed him. Um, that's the only way I can reckon how do 5,000 men exactly follow this guy Hagoth across an ocean, and it only makes sense that they had a very powerful bond that had an origin in the war that had just happened in Nephite history, and um, and so and Alma's son goes with them, which is also an interesting tidbit to include in the scripture.
Repentant son, by the way, for my audience members that are not as literate in Alma as they think they might be, Corianton did repent
Mm-hmm.
according to the words of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, and so they show up, and one of the origin or early stories of this group coming into Europe, um, across the ocean, is that they kind of landed in a spot that was open, and it looked settleable to them. Like, hey, this looks like a pretty good place. Let's plant some stuff and set up a community here. And that early on in that process, they ran into a Roman legion, a Roman legion ran into them, and was kind of like, "Who the heck are you guys? What are you doing here? This is our, territory. You can't just come here." So this is a Langobardi story. So they go to their leader and they say, let's leave. Let's go somewhere else. We don't want a fight. We don't want war," which is very consistent with the reasoning of the Hagoth followers in the Book of Mormon. They wanted to get away from war, and that's why they left Desolation. They were sick of it. They just want to go to a new place. Well, they get over here to Europe and they find more war. So they go to the leader and they say, "Hey, this isn't what we were looking for. Let's go somewhere else." Um, and he tells them something to the effect of, "Remember the Lord your God, and he will give you victory. Follow me and, the Lord your God, and we'll have victory." And the record simply says that they won. They had victory. They defeated this initial threat, which was something of a crazy one, right? 5,000 men is a goodly number of people, but compared to an organized Roman legion on home turf, so to speak, it's a bit awkward to get into a battle with um, an empirical civilization that's trying to take over everything. And as we'll see,
maybe they felt like they were on home turf because the Elbe River was so much like the River Sidon.
Yeah, well, that's it. Well, that's another interesting point, isn't it? How important the River Sidon is in the Book of Mormon as a theme and an element in the story, and how the Elbe River plays an important role in this group of people.
Hey, well, before you keep going too far down that road, let me keep moving with this theme so that we can keep going down the list here, because we've got some other interesting pieces. The elves in the lore are known as the people of light. Mm-hmm. Galadriel is the lady of light, and that goes back to enforcing the meaning that it's not so much about the color of skin. It's much about this people being enlightened. They are people of light. They have inspired powers in this lore. Now, in lore, it's going to take on a very telestial, very terrestrial, earthy type of look to it, where they've got magical powers, etc. Well, but that in lore speak, that's just representative of the power of God. That they have these enlightened powers to help the people, and so the elves embody that. They have these lifespans that are extremely long, aka eternal.
Yeah, they
so
live longer.
this idea of
life.
well, it's embedded eternal life. I mean, they can be killed, so they're mortal, But again, it's lore. It's not. It's more parabolic. So you can't take every single detail and perfectly apply it. But the idea is that the overarching feeling of a lot of the themes are very applicable. So the eternal life piece is there. They're highly skilled in battle. They're highly skilled in craftsmanship. In general, craftsmanship. Okay. So these are some of the major pieces of the elves. Oh, by the way, it's represented most often than not in the
With a
lore
bow.
with the bow.
Mm-hmm.
And we've pointed out that we think that may be very significant, the sign of the bow. Not
Yeah.
with the longbows of England, and with in the lore of the Lord of the Rings, the elven people, they obviously are skilled with other weapons, no doubt, in the lore, but the bow is mentioned the most. I mean, the main elf in all of Lord of the Rings is Legolas, and what is his thing?
It's the
We
bow.
all know.
Yeah, the connection between the English longbow and the bow tradition among the elves is, I mean, it is the same thing. That I think, well, you can always argue, but I don't think you can argue it very well that any other case. What sticks out to me here, though, like again, coming from a more of a biblical or Hebrew understanding of things, um, and as Mormons today who are realizing the religious tradition we grew up in was not necessarily all correct, um, the there and realizing as you read scripture that there is a distinction between the children of men and the children of God or the sons of God. There is a distinction between those who have entered covenant and those who have not entered covenant. And so when the ancient Hebrews are saying, "Hey, we're a covenant people," they are trying to explain there's a difference between us and the rest of the peoples of the world, and that is we belong to Jesus Christ. We are in covenant with him. We are new creatures in Christ. We are on the other side of that line. You have the same thing going on in the New Testament, particularly with Paul, but the church of the apostles, the New Testament is primarily speaking to people who have actually entered the covenant and become enlightened by God's Spirit. They have received his Spirit. They are new creatures in Christ. The same thing is going on in the Nephite civilization. There are groups that have the Spirit of God. Now, it's not every single individual, right? But it there's a history that goes back and forth. But the tradition and where they're always trying to stay is to be in that covenant with God, to be the covenant people, which is, and to be in the covenant is assuming or implying that you have the Spirit of God with you, or his light, or his power.
Right.
And
Yep.
so the elven people, all of the patterns suggest the same thing, that they are appealing to, we're on the other side of that covenant line. We are enlightened through God's Spirit. We have his power through that gift. We are a light, white people in terms of our covenant with Jesus Christ. And but as growing up in the Brighamite LDS tradition, we grew up in this idea that, well, we're that people, but then you wake up and realize you don't actually have that gift for real. You've just been living in a tradition that told you that you had it, and it remains to actually go get it. So it's this funny thing, like, and people, modern Christians or LDS who read the Bible, who read the New Testament, will take a lot of the statements written to covenant peoples and say, okay, this applies to us because we're also a covenant people, when in fact we may not be a covenant people officially yet because we haven't received that gift and we're not on the other side of that line. And this is something did we do this in episode 1? This was like, or episode 2, trying to tease out and establish this line between what does it mean to receive the gift of the Holy Ghost for real, and what is the tradition of having received it.
I don't think we. I don't think we.
Received it.
Yeah, I don't think we got into that. And for the sake of now, let's not go into it.
No,
So we
we
keep going
did.
here.
We totally did. It was
Did we?
episode 1 or 2. Yeah.
I, when we say teased out, I imagine a little bit more exposition. We may have mentioned it.
I think it was episode 2. We hammered it over. I did.
Okay. Well, actually, you know what? Well, you. So I guess in my mind I'm thinking a little bit more exposition, but we definitely did talk about it. I do. It was actually I used it in the intro. Okay, let's move on though. When
Okay.
we're talking about the lore, it's not just about the elves because the lore. So again, I'm not a history expert, but I know enough to get me in trouble where we say, okay, listen, when anciently speaking, when lore's developed, what's happening is you have different aspects of a culture, different aspects of history that get bodied into story so that you can pass it down easily orally, especially when it comes into lore. Right? It's not meant to be direct history. It's meant to be more occultic, meaning hidden. It's veiled. It's a veiled history. So in this sense, with the lore and Lord of the Rings, the he's Tolkien isn't inventing all of this lore. He's drawing from this lore and then he's infusing it into his own story. But he's not trying to change a lot of the lore because he's trying to preserve.
He's Yeah, he's trying to preserve the spirit of the mythology, or the mythology is the spirit of the history, so to speak.
Right. And so because of that, we're not just looking at one group of people, which is the most obvious group, the elven people. We're actually looking at the body of the lore. So we'll also look to the dwarves, the race of dwarves, which is interesting because they are called the Longbeards. And this takes us right back to the Langobards,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the Longbeards. I mean, that's not lost on Tolkien to specifically call them Longbeards. So he's now drawing on this Hebrew connection of having long beards, and they are also very skilled in battle, but that's not what they're mostly known for. They're particularly known for their mining craftsmanship um, for jewels, gold, silver, etc., which the Nephites in the Book of Mormon they're famous for. Actually, they're infamous for because it's what got them into trouble so often. God would bless them with being able to get the richness of the earth, gold and silver, etc., all the precious things, and then that would eventually corrupt them as that became the source of what they worshipped more than anything, and then that got them into trouble, etc., etc. So this piece, their culture that came with them across the ocean, they brought everything with them, good and bad, because the Nephites weren't always good. Another piece of that was their stubbornness, which you mentioned, also was actually a, a, a trait of the elves as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the Nephites, when you pay attention, the word stubborn isn't used in the Book of Mormon, but the description of stubborn is used constantly throughout the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. In the mythology, the dwarves are created by the elves, and so that they have a similar origin in that sense, but the dwarves are sort of inferior in a sense to a true elf. Um, but it like I say, and going into the meaning of dwarf in the Old Saxon and German, it is referring to like a smaller, shorter person. I would tend to think or suggest that this might be referring to groups of people who inherited information or culture or some kind of benefit through this original elven people. So you have the offshooting peoples who aren't
Right.
maybe the original of the original glory, so to speak, um, but they embody a part of it moving forward. So they have a descendancy from it.
Well, and to that point, it's this idea of making them shorter, like being a smaller in stature. The smaller in spiritual stature in that sense that they are particularly more stubborn. They focus more on treasures of the earth. this idea that they're offshoot from the elves. It's almost representing that piece of history where it shows how the Nephites corrupted themselves at times.
Mm-hmm.
You know that they are that when you know how people say you're a shell of your former self. You know, you're you're a lesser form of yourself prior. You know, people make that claim because you've taken a step down from where you were at before. That kind of idea. The dwarves tend in the lore tend to kind of embody a lot of that, which is really interesting. So there's quite a bit there that makes Lord of the Rings actually support the Nephites in Europe in that sense. There's a lot of connections now. Say, oh, you're just drawing these connections out of thin air. Maybe, except that it's tying into everything that we've been talking about. So it really starts to mount. The evidence starts to mount in high
So
fashion.
the original or older definition of mythology is true history that's been obscured by time. So we don't
Right.
necessarily have all the details anymore, but it is
Right. Right.
nonetheless it is the history to the degree that we still have it, or it's referring to things which are true. Sometime in the I think the 20s, the definition literally was changed overnight to mean like a false history, a fake history, which is not at all what the original thing meant. So mythology, again, has an origin in truth. And that was the primary reason that Tolkien wanted to preserve it, was that
Right.
the history of the English and the German peoples, what was left of it was bound up in the mythology. And that itself was being lost to the modern sort of more Latin Rome Catholic based. Well, and it's an irony because Tolkien was a very staunch Catholic,
Right.
and yet he had
So
this real bend on preserving the Germanic and English mythology and trying to capture the essence or spirit of the stories. And that's why Lord of the Rings is so cool. Is it largely succeeds in doing that. Like
right.
this story, um, I mean, there aren't many works in the Western world that that are stronger and bigger than the Lord of the Rings in terms of their impact, their influence, the well, I mean, like all modern fantasy fiction and novels are set in a Tolkien paradigm. Um, we just half the video games of today are still playing on a mythology that Tolkien preserved through his work that was referring to a true history of the past. And so looking at the pieces that we have, whether through Tolkien and Lord of the Rings or elven naming conventions among the English or whatever histories we can find like the Langobardi origin document. We're kind of trying to look into a history that has been obscured by time and by design on in terms of the Holy Roman agenda to remove the history of the German and English peoples and insert, a Latin propaganda version. Um, and so, we in modern times, it's hard to appreciate this, but it's very true. We're very Roman Catholic in our thinking, in our paradigm, in our rhetoric, because the other thing that we came from was obscured and taken and covered up, and the
Right.
books were burned. And so, trying to capture the essence of it, Lord of the Rings is it's one of the best ways to kind of tap into this different paradigm and get a feel for it, and then try to work through the other histories that yet exist or bits of it, to try to develop this alternate sense of, okay, this is not Roman, this is not Catholic, this is Germanic in origin and something very different. And tapping into that it takes time and thought, but I suggest, again, for me it's been a really cool exploration to try to dive into the Book of Mormon and appreciate the paradigm represented there in the Lehite culture and society.
Right.
And then seeing elements of that play in the Europe, like North and West European theater, in this battle between the culture of Rome and the culture of the German and the English.
We had a question here.
Mm-hmm.
This is about 15 minutes ago. Nikki Lee said, "What is the source of this story?" And then I clarified in the chat. She's asking particularly about the story of Hagoth going to Europe and fighting the Romans. So we'll just anybody, Nikki and anyone else, refer to our previous 2 episodes, Nephites in Europe, parts 1 and 2, to answer that question. Excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for asking that. Okay, so there is going to be more inside of the lore behind Lord of the Rings that the people can explore. We pointed out some of the big overarching pieces that we like to emphasize for the sake of this conversation. It's fun to talk about more, but I think we have just enough time left to talk about some DNA markers that help tie the Anglo-Saxon people to the Native American people. With just a little bit of time we have left. And this is fitting because we talked about naming conventions that tied the two groups. Over here in Northern Europe, over here in America, we have really similar Hebrew naming convention, but the diathematic naming. We have a couple of DNA markers that connect some of these Anglo-Saxon peoples to the Native American peoples to show that, hey, there is some possible genetic relation, which we should find if they're related, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, this originally came when I found this short 5-minute video trying to trace um, some of the DNA markers in Joseph Smith, interestingly enough. And then I sent that little video over to you. It's that short 5-minute video, and it talked about various different markers. But one in particular that you like to talk about, you want to mention, tell us that marker.
Yeah, so the haplogroup R1b, in the video you sent me, do we have the link on that?
Here, I'll pull that up.
If you can find it and put it in the chat. So basically, the video shows that Joseph Smith has the R1b marker, which seems to have, as far as anything is known about it, an origin in the Middle East, is represented among Native Americans, and Joseph had it. So the idea here is that, well, how is Joseph? We have this idea that he's a direct descendant of Joseph in Egypt, literally descended from the house of Israel. And if you go a little further and read between the lines slightly in the Book of Mormon, in Second Nephi, and I believe it's the case that Joseph not only needed to descend from Joseph in Egypt, he needed to descend from Joseph, the son of Lehi, as well. That's a different topic to explore. But the argument was, well, is there any genetic evidence that would tie into this idea? And it turns out that there is, or at least in this video was suggesting one marker. It's called the R1b haplogroup. It has an origin among Middle Eastern peoples. It's found in Native American DNA, and Joseph also had it. The interesting thing is that R1b is a very prominent haplogroup among Germanic peoples as well. So there you have the tie between Native Americans. So, I mean, we talked about the diathematic naming between Native Americans and Germans and Hebrews. Well, the R1b haplogroup, Middle Eastern, Native American, Germanic. So just another correlating piece of evidence on that.
Yeah, and that's really fun to take a look at. And I couldn't find the link while you were chatting. I was trying to pull it up. So what I'll do is I'll put it in the description of the video after the fact. I'll edit the description and put it in there. But there have been those DNA markers that connect those two groups. Here. Oh, did you got it? Okay, great. And that's just another interesting thing. They've found these DNA markers that are significant, that do connect them. And you think, okay, is that just random happenstance? And so The idea was to conclude the Nephites in Europe with this, at least our main pieces. I actually just remembered, Josh, the one other piece that we kind of discovered later that we actually need to talk about. There's not time to do it today. We had got it, and so I don't know if we do it next time or what. But the other big piece to talk about was the line of Zedekiah.
Oh yeah,
because as far as Nephites in Europe, I actually think that's the last big important piece that we need to talk about. Maybe we could talk about it in the next 10 minutes. It actually doesn't need to be super long. So let's do it here because I think we can wrap it up. So we will talk about it here. It doesn't need to be a whole episode or anything.
Give me 5 seconds before you go into that.
Okay.
Are you going to
pull up the video thing, or
what are you pulling up? This is just. I'll put this link in the comments as well.
Oh, gotcha. Showing the tracing of the
barbarian migration show mainly R1B lineages. And let's see, get that link, pop it over to here. So that's in the chat now.
Perfect.
And if you go, does this show? This is showing up on the screen still.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna pull up this is the video right here. Joseph Smith's DNA. This is the other link I already put in. And just ignore the ad.
The hidden genres, the hidden genes of Germany.
Oh no, that's not where I meant to go. This one right here.
That one. There we go. That's the one.
Yeah, for some reason it shifted over. Joseph Smith's DNA related to Joseph in Egypt. So he will talk, a lot about, okay, here's this R1B group. He has some a little more in depth specifically on that and Joseph's link to it. But what he doesn't touch on at all is the Germanic link. So then you jump over here, and R1B is a major haplogroup among Germanic tribes and people. So again, it's just this great connection to substantiate the Haygoth in Europe concept or theory.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So take a look at that. But in our last 10 minutes, I don't know if we need more than 10 minutes. Let's talk about the line of David and Jesus Christ, and how the Book of Mormon and Nephites in Europe plays into that. So I'm gonna give the rundown gist, and then I'm gonna let you interject as necessary to fill in some of the gaps. But here's the main idea that dawned on us when we were talking months back, where we're like, oh my gosh, how did we miss this big piece that seems so obvious? Where we know that the Book of Mormon believers know that the line of Zedekiah his line wasn't wiped out through his sons. Mulek is brought to the Americas, to the Promised Land. Obviously, they weren't the Americas back then. So Mulek's brought to the Promised Land, is integrated in with the Nephites. They call themselves, after they've been here for a couple hundred years, few hundred years, and they kind of lose their identity completely because they didn't bring records. So it's another idea of losing their identity, even though they were very directly, the house of David. They lost their identity. Then they kind of regain their identity with the Nephites, take on the name Nephites, and now the Mulekites are just blended in with the Nephites. So the seed of Mulek, the seed of David, the rightful heir. Mulek was the rightful heir to the throne. Now the tradition is that because all of the seed of Judah, of David, etc., that royal Judah seed was wiped out on the male side, that it continued to the daughters. And so we have this tradition that Jeremiah took one of the daughters, at least one of them, up, into Great Britain, etc. And that's eventually where Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Joseph, they come down from there. And that's how Jesus is the rightful heir, because he's from that bloodline. And I don't doubt that one bit. I believe he was. Now, here's where the problem runs into. If a descendant of David that was the male heir is alive at that point in time, then he is the rightful heir. And so what was pointed out is that if Mulek survived, then that means the rightful heirship to the throne of David continued actually through Mulek.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the recognizable line went through the daughters, meaning that people would recognize and honor because that's who they thought survived. They didn't know that Mulek survived. But the line that God would honor was through Mulek. So somehow, as far as Nephites in Europe is concerned, somehow Mulek's seed has to make it back over there to intermingle and that bloodline has to get back into a bloodline that winds up in Mary, Jesus's mother. So we have to so the idea is that Mulek's progeny is part of the group of 5,000 that goes with Hagoth and ends up in that Netherlands, Northern Germany, Denmark area that eventually ends up over into England, that eventually ends up in Mary's blood. And it's like, well, you don't have much time to do that. You only have 50 years to do that, to make that happen. It's like, well, you could make that happen in 50 years to have some mingling there that plays a part, especially because of the trade route that Joseph of Arimathea was a part of for his tin mining, et cetera, right? So that's the overall argument that if the line of David actually had a male heir and Mulek was that person, then Jesus had to come from that line if they were alive. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that correctly?
Yeah, and I wanted to back it up a little bit. The Book of Mormon, I was just trying to find the reference. It literally states that the lineage of Zedekiah, or the line, is among us in the Americas, among the Nephites.
Yeah, were you able to find that reference?
Yes, it is Helaman chapter 8, verse 21. And now will you dispute that Jerusalem was destroyed? Will ye say that the sons of Zedekiah were not slain, all except it were Mulek? Yea, and do ye not behold that the seed of Mulek are with us, and they were driven out of the land of Jerusalem? So the seed of, and Mulek, by the way, means the king. It's not his given name. Let me just pull up.
So 821, there it is. I got it on the screen.
Well, let's see. This one. Just again, Google here. Hebrew word. Now, Melech is the typical spelling, but vowels are interchangeable. And Mulek is an equally
Acknowledged.
proper way to express. So you don't have the vowels in the original
Right.
Hebrew.
Both Melech and Mulek are acknowledged.
It's the same word. It's exactly the same word. The vowels were used interchangeably depending on other factors, but Melech and Mulek are the same word, and it means the king. So Mulek, the significance of Mulek in the Book of Mormon, being the son of Zedekiah, was that he was the king of Israel after Zedekiah. At least that's the lineal spiritual significance of Mulek being among the Lehite civilization. And so, yeah, there's a reason why we know about that. There's a reason why Mulek had to go to the Americas, just like there's a reason that Lehi had to go.
Right. That's the part that's so awesome, is that all of a sudden you realize everything is right there in front of you and it has been hiding in plain sight. The idea of the Nephites going to Europe and kind of being hidden, their identity to be preserved, all of a sudden is, if we retrograde and go backwards, it's exactly what God did with Mulek, with the line of Zedekiah. He brought them to the promised land, mixed them in with another people. They lost their individual identity over it, but it still was preserved.
And there's a reason. If Joseph is who we think he is, he had to have a lineage that fit prophecy and scripture, and it had to come. Mulek had to go to America, and Hagoth had to go somewhere, and then Joseph and or the lineage around him had to come out of that somehow. And so it all lines up very nicely with the German Haggothite theory and how that moves into the English,
Right.
the later English group, which then is the group. If there's a name to the modern Gentiles in particular, it's the English, in terms of the English coming over on the Mayflower, the English fighting the Revolutionary War with the mother Gentiles or mother England, and the Gentiles are certainly broader than the English exactly, but the English are this the most central or represented group, with all German groups kind of secondarily around that, and then European in general seems to be also like again that Germanic blood. Um, it moved well. The Celtic blood swept through Europe earlier. Then the Germanic blood did the same thing later and intermixed with the Celtic blood. And so, did we get where you're going, or were you going to take this further with the lineage of Christ and all that?
No, that just to lay that other piece of evidence of Nephites in
Mhm.
Europe, that's a logical evidence, right? We're logically
Yeah.
placing that if the line of David had been preserved through the male line, Jesus has to come through that line. He has to,
Right.
because he
Oh, good point.
is the rightful heir, and so therefore that blood over in the promised land has to somehow
Yep.
make its way back.
Jesus has to come through that line somehow. And what gets more interesting is that line has to continue after Jesus.
Right, and that line has to, exactly 100%. Uh, so that's I just wanted to place that so that we could not forget it, first of all, because it's a huge and interesting piece. It doesn't take too long to cover. We just covered it, but that wraps up our bulk of evidence that we wanted to address for Nephites in Europe. I'm positive that there's more we could talk about in that sense, but after this, we'll be looking more into the promises made to Joseph of Egypt and how that relates to lineages, priesthood, etc., which we've talked about briefly. We'll spend more time talking about that looking forward, so that we can increase our understanding of our identity as a people. And that's the whole point of this. What Moroni said to Joseph, section 2, the idea of revealing the priesthood to the people so that the hearts of the children can turn to their fathers, the promises made to the fathers can be planted in the hearts of the children, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
So 333, that's the time, and we are officially wrapping up this episode. So we will be jumping over to chat on Zoom for those that want to join us for our afternoon chatter, and that will be on these topics or any other topics people want to bring up. Thank you so much for joining. I guess we could drop that Zoom link in the chat for anyone that wants
Yep.
to join us
Pulling
over
it
there.
up.
So we'll do that. And then, of course, we'll see you all next time next week.
It is the same link as last week, but I will repost it again. I could have had that queued.
That's okay.
Okay, there's our Zoom link for if you want to jump in on the conversation, if you've got your own comments to make, join us for a few minutes afterward for some live chat. Thanks, everybody.